Egress is the Adventure Time episode that could be considered the best episode by most people. It is often claimed that this episode can be interpreted in many different ways, and yet it's hard to find a different perspective other than Hall of Egress is about growth. The specifics on how people view this episode might differ slightly, but they basically boil down to growing up. For those unfamiliar with the episode, it goes as follows. Finn and Jake are suggested a dungeon and soon find themselves at the entrance. Finn moves ahead and gets trapped into the dungeon where he's only able to progress once he closes his eyes, but even if he exits the dungeon, he lands back at the foyer once he regains sight. From here on, Finn cycles through this loop for an undefined amount of time, and while his friends try to help him, he just lands back at the foyer over and over and over again. Eventually, Finn has to leave his friends behind, as well as his worldly possessions, and after an undetermined amount of time, he finds the dungeon again. Apparently, this journey forced Finn to reach some sort of enlightenment to the point that he now can see the dungeon's maze with open eyes. And so, finally, Finn is able to exit the dungeon and reunite with Jake.
What would you want to be in future?
I would like to be a terrorist.
The most common interpretation of the episode is of course that Hall of Egress is supposed to represent Finn's journey from childhood to adulthood. Indeed, a lot of things speak for that interpretation. Finn's own idea of a dungeon gets subverted once a trap is sprung on him in the foyer instead of the actual dungeon proper. To move ahead, he has to let go of one of his senses, namely his sight, or metaphorically speaking, his old worldview. When he tries to map the invisible maze, he lands only on traps, and it's only when he lets go of all his old ways of thinking is he able to move forward. He's also forced, or rather chooses to leave his friends behind since they don't seem to provide any help. And finally, he's forced to get rid of his old identity as well, symbolized by how Finn lets go of all his old clothes. For Finn to finally exit, he needed to change physically, mentally, and to a certain extent spiritually. He needed a painful transition from child to young adult. Of course, you can dive deeper into everything and the specifics can change depending on how you want to lay out the puzzle pieces, but generally speaking, that is how most people choose to see this episode. What is strange is that the dungeon itself is not a metaphysical place. It is a real place inside of the universe. It even springs a physical trap, probably enhanced with some sort of magic, but it's still a physical trap that you can fall into. The trap actually asks a very specific action from the dungeon crawler. You have to let go of your sight to be able to progress, and you have to let go of your perception to exit the physical location. Once outside of the dungeon proper, you have to traverse it, find another dungeon, which will allow you to open your eyes and finally exit the dungeon. So the question is, what does Finn actually learn here? Finn learns to stop perceiving with his eyes, stop trusting any of his thought patterns, stop trusting his friends, and going primal. That, I would say, is a very strange view of adulthood. It's telling us that sight, thought, and friends are unreliable, at least in the text. Of course, it could also be that all of the happenings inside of the dungeon are purely metaphorical, and the trap is actually activated once you step foot into the dungeon, and therefore everything is metaphorical, and there is no actual time loop. It's just inside of Finn's head. Be it as it is, all of it could just symbolize that the journey to adulthood is often arduous, painful, and lonely.
My crew is big and it keeps getting bigger. That's cause Jesus Christ is my...
Hall of Egress is the Adventure Time episode that could be considered the best episode by most. Oh, I see. The big gimmick of this video is the gimmick of the episode. Very clever. Very smart, I would say. Okay, alright. I play along. One of the other interpretations I could find is that blind faith in God is the pathway to egress. Finn does indeed need blind faith to be able to exit the dungeon. If we take into consideration that Finn also has to shed all his worldly possessions as well as one of his senses, this does indeed hint towards faith in a higher power. Towards the end, when Finn hears PB's voice as well as BMO's, we even get the confirmation that Finn to a certain extent deifies PB. BMO, while not always clear in the show, represents some sort of spiritual guide for him, further underlying this religious perspective. So, this is a valid interpretation that only blind faith in a deity will lead you out of the maze that is your inner world or life in general. Of course, some could ask the question when blind faith in a deity is shown, but this could be dismissed by remembering that only after Finn reaches enlightenment is he able to hear God's voice, aka PB. It is an interesting thought that blind faith is the purpose of this episode, because while Finn is blind, he's still relying on other senses: hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. You could say that blind faith is the opposite of what the episode is trying to say. It is rather communicating that you shouldn't always rely on a certain sense, since it can trick you into believing something is there when it's not. The dungeon door can only be passed when you close your eyes after all. The dungeon itself can only be traversed once you give up on a certain way of thinking. So, the text suggests that rather than having blind faith, you should have no faith at all and only rely on yourself.
Do it! Just do it!
Hall of Egress is the Adventure Time episode that could be I can see that this will get boring really quickly. While indeed the episode can be seen as a metaphor for growing up and to a certain extent a metaphor for blind faith, much more speaks to the interpretation that you should only rely on yourself, or mainly rely on yourself. Pretty much every aspect of the dungeon speaks for it. You can't trust your sight, you can't trust your prior experience, and you can't trust your friends. The only way out of the dungeon is to completely rely on your gut feeling and fight your way through the dungeon alone. One of course must ask the question here why specifically sight is taken away, but simply put, sight is the one thing we depend the most on. If you miss taste, touch, hearing, and the fourth one, you can still traverse the world fine. While the rest of the senses are extremely important, none are as important as sight. Relying only on sight makes you too dependent on it, so it makes sense that the dungeon takes away sight if the lesson is to be self-reliant. Even giving up on prior knowledge fits here, since the dungeon is asking for you to stop relying on old tested
knowledge.
The dungeon eventually even forces the dungeon crawler to leave his friends and go primal. Of course, all of this could be put into question since Finn essentially learned all these lessons in prior episodes. Finn could be considered the textbook example of self-reliance. Also, having close friends that are able to help you is part of self-reliance as well. Here, the text and subtext are a bit at odds. If you take, of course, all of this being a metaphor, it kind of makes sense, but if you take it at face value, the waters become a bit muddled.
Guys, don't be like my friend here who didn't do anything. Not doing anything is part of the problem.
Hall of As I said, this was going to get old really quickly. Anyways, an interesting interpretation is focused on what Finn does once he finds his way out of the first level of the dungeon. As we can see from the episode, Finn repeats this process of exiting the first level of the dungeon over and over again and just waits for something to change. His inactions lead him to eventually open his eyes, or to be forced to open his eyes just to find himself back at the start again. It is only when he does something that his world changes. His actions, more than anything else, lead him out of the maze. Of course, the problem here is that Finn already tries to do something by changing things every time he's set back to the foyer. He's neither literally nor metaphorically doing nothing. He's actually seeking for a way out, but the dungeon is asking for such a convoluted set of actions that if the message is that inaction leads to stagnation, it's really not that clear.
Someone once told me time is a flat circle.
Hall of... Maybe this whole thing just exists to tell that time is a flat circle. No matter what you do, you will always end up back where you started. Even if you fundamentally change yourself, gain some sort of alignment, you'll find yourself at the beginning again. But maybe now with a different perspective, able to see or perceive more of the world than before, but still at the same place. Finn, weirdly enough, was already perceiving things differently and coming up with clever ways to traverse the dungeon, So here we kind of circle back to the question, what does Finn actually learn? It's not like he wasn't already capable of surviving on his own alone and seeing, for example, the astral plane, so being some sort of enlightened person. He was already impressive before and didn't really get marginally better at the things he does after the dungeon.
Life is pointless and nothing matters, and I'm always tired. Also, I can't sleep. I'm overeating. None of my old hobbies interest me.
Hall of, please stop. Just stop. Well, all of this could also just mean that the universe is chaotic and it doesn't give a shit. You can do random things, you can do methodical things, you can try new things, old things, weird things, and things in general, and nothing will change. At the end, it doesn't matter, you just have to march on through the darkness and chaos, and maybe if you're lucky, you might reach some sort of enlightenment.
What the fuck is this?
I don't know.
Hall of no. I don't want to do this anymore. Well, and sometimes it doesn't mean anything. Sometimes you have to accept that there is no answer. It doesn't mean that you have grown, that the world was against you, or people hindered you. It just means that there was no answer. Sometimes, some people just have a cool idea about an episode like, wouldn't it be cool if Finn got trapped in a dungeon and when he opens his eyes, he gets teleported to the beginning of the dungeon. And another guy goes like, oh, and maybe we should connect it to like prior episodes like the Dungeon Train that has a similar mechanic and the relationship with Flame Princess and so on. And another guy goes like, oh, and it has to reach some sort of enlightenment to be able to traverse the dungeon. And yeah, and then, you know, a tapestry of ideas get collaged together and some of it fits, most of it fits, but not all of it. The text and subtext fight a bit, but in generally it's a really good episode.
There's no way out of this one. You're done.
In all the interpretations, has anyone thought about what is actually happening to Finn? This boy runs into this dungeon, unknowingly stepping in one of the most insidious traps you ever saw. It dangles a simple solution in front of you like the snowman, but is it? Or are we just assuming that? Why would rearranging the snowman do anything? Why would the person who created this dungeon make it so easy? No. Finn beat it the correct way. But has anyone stopped to think what is actually happening to Finn? Finn solves the first part of the dungeon pretty quickly. He closes his eyes and is able to walk through the door. But then the true horror begins. He has to find his way through the dungeon, but every time he's fatally hurt, he's just teleported back in time and back to the foyer. Let that sink in for a moment. Finn is trapped in a time loop. A time loop that is unbeatable unless you're blind. Sure, Finn finds the next step, but it's only when he's on the brink of breaking down. And by that time, we don't even know how many times Finn has resetted. The specific wording is,
so, every map I make is wrong. All the exit signs led to traps. Plus the braille, the hieroglyphics, and the tape recorder message too. It's almost like the maze is trying to tell me something.
How many maps has Finn made? 1, 2, 3, 50? In this section alone, Finn might have been reset in the double digits. When Finn finally finds his way back into the world, he is just reset back once he opens his eyes, and it seems like his friends are predisposed to force his eyes open.
Yeah, you've done it like 30 times now.
The fact that Finn is not gripped by an existential fear and desperation of being trapped in this dungeon for eternity is commendable. Still, we can see that this trial has broken something in him to the point that Finn chooses to leave everything and searches for an answer alone. By the time we see Finn again, we don't even know how many days he was trapped in darkness. At some point, Finn lets go of his clothes. We see him put on a blindfold, walking through the wilderness, sleeping in the middle of a forest, eating something on a weird mountain, walking through a volcano, and finally reaching a desert. Here's the thing. I don't think he did all of this on his first try, because once he reaches the Hall of Egress in the desert, he doesn't only take one blindfold off, he takes 3 of them off. Finn probably got mortally wounded along the way in his first try and decided to put on a second and eventually a third blindfold on because they can be easily ripped off. So how many times did Finn try this out? How many times was he resetted? We can assume at least 3 times, but do you think he managed to do all of this journey in 3 attempts? We can see that when Finn first sets out alone, he's not very proficient in navigating the world blindly, but as he stumbles on a tree trunk. It is only towards the end of the episode we can see Finn is using all of his senses, like hearing, to navigate through this world. But even then, he's not very proficient at it. We can also see that along the way he has acquired many wounds and bruises even after using all of his senses. One must ask the question, how long was Finn wandering about the world constantly gripped by fear that he might have opened his eyes or be forced to open his eyes by one of his friends that caught him? Most of the time we focus on the metaphorical view of the episode, and while there is value in that, I've yet to hear about the existential horror that is this dungeon mechanic. It takes away your sight, it takes away your experience, it takes away your friends and family. It takes away your choice to end things. You are forced to live through this again and again until you randomly find some sort of enlightenment that is not even clear what it is. It is such an insidious dungeon, and that might also be the reason why we don't really talk about how fucked up it is. Ironically, the discussion around this episode is kind of the trap that we the viewers fall into. We're so blinded by the lessons that the episode is trying to communicate, maybe even confused by it, that we lose sight of the horror that is to be forced through this whole ordeal. With all that said, if you don't subscribe, I hope you're trapped in a time loop. Take care of yourselves and have a nice, wonderful day. Hall of Egress is the Adventure Time episode that could be considered the best episode by most people. It is often claimed that this episode can be interpreted in many different ways, and that it's hard to find a different perspective other than Hall of Egress is about growth.